And the kind of politics Narendra Modi is articulating is not only Hindu nationalism, it's also a way to communicate. BJP, I don't know. Narendra Modi for sure wants to pursue that. Modi is so popular that he can afford to organize elections and win them. These two characters may not be so sure. A famous phrase that says democracies don't fight each other. There is no war between democracies. And the diminishing number of democracies in the world using nationalism as their main idiom is definitely taking us in a very dangerous direction by Modi, probably trying to have its own candidate.
Hello and welcome to InferTalks, a podcast where I put you in the room with some of the biggest thought leaders from around the world. Joining me today for a conversation is a renowned political scientist, a published author, and a thinker, Dr. Christophe Jaffrelot. Dr. Jaffrelot is a senior research fellow at the Center for International Research. Dr. Jaffrelot, welcome to InferTalks.
Thank you.
Professor, let's go ahead and start our conversation. And the first question that I really want to ask you is about the rise of Hindu nationalism. You've been giving talks about it in Pakistan so far. Let me go ahead and ask you my very first question. Ever since Prime Minister Modi has come into power in India, have you seen any change take place within the polity of India? Do you see any change that has been as a consequence of him coming into power? Or is he representing a symptom of what has really been going on for the last many decades within the country?
No, there is a change, clearly. There is a change because you've seen the rise of a new politics based on national populism. Hindu nationalism was there before and could rule the country to some extent under Vajpayee before. But this is national populism. And the kind of politics Narendra Modi is articulating is not only Hindu nationalism, it's also a way to communicate this ideology. Now, the populist relates directly to the people in the name of emotions, and he does that a lot, very successfully. By the way, he did it before in Gujarat as chief minister. And that's the number one change. The number two change is the populist is also having a personal relations. It implies a personalization of power, and power is really in his hands. That is not so new for India because Indira Gandhi did the same to some extent many years before, but it's new for BJP. His party used to be a collegial organization. Vajpayee and Advani, for instance, were together at the helm. And this is also related to centralization of power, and at the expense of federalism, at the expense of the parliament, at the expense of many institutions, to such an extent that you can say that we have a new political system. It's not the same parliamentary democracy we used to know. It's also a system where other institutions, other than the parliament, the judiciary, for instance, have lost some of their authority, some of their autonomy, and the list is very long. You can also mention the Election Commission of India that is not as as much independent as it used to be, the Reserve Bank of India. So yes, it's a different political system.
Why, very briefly, why do you think that really is the reason? Why is there not so much interest in devolving the power away from the center and more in terms of, concentrating the power within the center? What really is the rationale behind it? And why does BJP sort of want to pursue that path?
Well, BJP, I don't know. Narendra Modi for sure wants to pursue that. And that's something he did already when he was chief minister of Gujarat. This idea that you concentrate power and relate directly to the people and get the legitimacy from the people. This is what the national populists do across the globe. It's not so specific to India in that sense. What is new for India is this system. This system exists elsewhere.
So now let me come to elections. We're eyeing an election next year in India, and there's a greater chance, there's a greater probability that Prime Minister Modi is going to get re-elected. What do you really see him do when he's re-elected into power? you see him become more assertive in terms of the way he's conducted, his country so far, the policies that he has unrolled so far, which have sort of consolidated the form of Hindu nationalism, its expression as well? Or do you see him becoming more, benign leader in terms of leaving a legacy which would be remembered in manner that has not been remembered so far?
Well, it's difficult to speculate. If we go by what happened in 2019, when he was re-elected, immediately after being re-elected, he indeed became more assertive. Abolition of Article 370, giving autonomy to Jammu and Kashmir, the amendment of the Citizenship Act, making non-Muslims, only non-Muslims, eligible to Indian citizenship when they were coming as refugees from Pakistan, Bangladesh, or Afghanistan. These two reforms, these two laws were passed immediately after his re-election, showing that he was indeed more assertive. 2024, if he is re-elected, which is not for sure, may see something similar. He may try to complete the list of commitments RSS and BJP as for years. They wanted three things: abolition of Article 370, the building of the Ayodhya temple, and the temple will be inaugurated on the 24th of January, which means that it will be the beginning of the election campaign, by the way. And then a uniform civil code. That may be the third reform that he may indeed implement if he wants to show more assertive policies.
All right. And now let me come towards, the next election that might be in 2029. And there has been talks that, it's perhaps Modi passing on a baton to a successor in 2029. What do you think would his successors do? Would they try to cross the bar of a more assertive expression that you're saying is likely to continue in the years to come? And thus, where do you see India moving closer towards? Would it be, more closer towards that expression or that realization of the goal of Hindu Rashtra? What do you see, or, where exactly does your research inform you that India is likely to be headed, in the next decade?
Well, it's difficult, again, to anticipate. What I foresee is certainly more diverging trends across the subcontinent. India is a subcontinent in itself. The South is now turning its back to BJP. None of the southern states is ruled by the BJP, Tamil Nadu, Kerala, Karnataka, Telangana, Andhra Pradesh. And that is certainly a new development in the fact that the northern and the southern states are diverging to that extent, politically, but also economically, educationally, in so many ways. That is probably a trend we will see in the coming years to come, in the 10 days that you are mentioning. The question you ask is also, after Modi, who? Because you assume that you will have a successor. It's not so sure. These leaders don't designate successors most of the time, except when they have a son, but it's not his case. And these leaders create a kind of vacuum around them. So
why do they do that?
Well, because they concentrate power in such a way that they monopolize power. And they don't want to take any risk with alternative leaders coming up. So today, there are potentially two successors. Amit Shah, the Home Minister, Yogi Adityanath, the Chief Minister of Uttar Pradesh, who are very different. We represent completely different profiles.
And what difference would you see that, when you actually speak about these two personalities compared to Modi?
Well, Modi is so popular that he can afford to organize elections and win them. These two characters may not be so sure.
But, it's the Amit Shah who's actually, really successful in terms of making sure that the election campaigns are managed successfully for BJP
Yes, not for BJP, for Modi. He is managing elections for Modi. He is not the one who wins election. He is the one who prepares the ground for the Modi magic, as we say, to work. It's a different game to be the one on the platform in a position to win votes. So there'll be these two profiles in competition probably. And then there'll be RSS, which has been marginalized by Modi, probably trying to have its own candidate. And that will be an interesting moment. In many places where national populists have been forced to leave the scene, the transition has been complicated. And after Indira Gandhi's era, Congress also had a tough time.
Right. Now let me come to another interesting dimension or dynamic that you've actually highlighted by way of your research that you've done and your colleagues in India and and in other varsities have actually helped you with. There's one interesting insight you've actually made, and this is about the fact that there's underrepresentation of Muslims in Indian police force. But on the other hand, which you've actually revealed, is that there's a disturbing pattern of a higher proportion of Muslims, in Indian prisons. What does this exactly reveal about the Indian Muslims facing discrimination within the country's criminal justice system?
Well, this is indeed very interesting. It's not only, again, in India. You would see the same thing in the US with the blacks and others. You have something like 20% of the prison inmates who are Muslims as under trial. You have 16% as convicted. The gap between 16 and 20 reflects the bias of the police. They put Muslims behind bars, and when the judiciary looks at the file, it is so weak that they release people who have sometimes spent months, if not years, in jail. These are data that are really systematically observed in most of the states. Only Bihar is different. Mind you, in every state, the minorities are overrepresented in jail. Hindus are overrepresented in the Jammu and Kashmir jail.
Oh.
Sikh people are underrepresented in the Punjabi jails. Police is a state subject. And you see how it can influence, how the sociology of the police can influence.
So this pattern is quite consistent across different states.
There are a few exceptions. Bihar is one of them. Mm-hmm. Assam has become very difficult for Muslims. In Assam, the overrepresentation of Muslims behind bars is just...
Why is that?
That's because of the politics of the government. After they passed this Citizenship Amendment Act, they try to make sure that Bangladeshi immigrants would be identified, possibly deported. And then you had a kind of policing of the state that affected the Muslims of the place, be they Bangladeshis or not.
Now let's speak about, India's foreign policy expression under BJP. We've seen the Hindu nationalism at home take a lot of, pronounced expression in its form in terms of foreign policy as well. And thus, we see even countries which in previous years were more closely aligned with India, for example, countries like Bhutan, which, in quasi manner has sort of outsourced its foreign policy, its, defense to India, has now taken has started taking more of an independent approach where you see Bhutan, dealing directly with China in terms of deciding demarcation of its borders. And now recently, the newly elected president in Bhutan has said, in Maldives has actually said that, he's demanded the Indian forces to withdraw from the archipelago nation. What do you then really see, or what has been the consequence of this, more assertive approach in terms of foreign policy for India's neighborhood?
Yeah, well, India is isolated in its neighborhood. Mm-hmm. But it's not only because of this assertive attitude. Certainly, it has not helped, and vis-à-vis Nepal also, it has been counterproductive. Vis-à-vis Bangladesh, possibly, but Nepal certainly. But it's also because of the Chinese attitude. China has made a point to relate directly, engage India's neighbors. Sri Lanka, of course, Pakistan, Maldives, certainly, Bangladesh, Nepal, and now Bhutan. So it's difficult to know what is the main factor for this new regional arrangement. What is evident, what is obvious, is that for India, the sentiment of being encircled by friends of China is one of the reasons why it is now so positive about the Quad, about Indo-Pacific strategies. Western countries like the US, like France, which were not that welcome in the Indian Ocean because precisely it was the ocean of India, are now more than welcome. Precisely because you have to resist China in that part of the world where, new deep sea ports made in China, Gwadar, Ulaanbaatar, new military bases are creating a psychosis, at least a sentiment of encirclement on the Indians.
But don't you think that pronounced approach has sort of pushed to the back burner that once very cherished policy of, neighborhood first policy of India itself, and now where you see, assertive policy leading to stonewalling of neighbors itself?
Yeah, well, it doesn't mean that India is not trying to engage some of these countries. For instance, Sri Lanka.
Yes.
The attempt at building a port, you can say a joint venture, is there. India tries to engage Sri Lanka, but the relationship between Colombo and Beijing is so strong that there is a limit to that. So the priority is certainly not to counter China in its neighborhood by engaging the local, these countries. The priority is to be part of a larger coalition with Japan, Australia, the US, European countries in the Indo-Pacific.
And so one more question that comes to mind about foreign policy itself is that, don't you think a pronounced approach or a more, an emphatic exercise of nationalistic foreign policy has, or perhaps could lead to India's own neighbors reflecting or perhaps mirroring an expression of their own assertive foreign policy, or a more nationalistic expression within their domestic politics and its projection in their foreign policies also?
Yeah, well, domestic politics and foreign policies are interaction. Well, on the Indian side, it's obvious. Modi is touring the world and urging every president, every prime minister to show that he has made India great again. And it works brilliantly in India. This feeling of this is the Indian moment, we can be proud of what we are. The self-esteem is retrieved that way. Now, of course, when you assert your identity that way, when you are that nationalistic, those who are fearing the big brother next door become also more nationalistic. And there is another dialectic that can result in more Sinhalese, Sri Lankan, but Sinhalese nationalism, more Pakistani nationalism, more Bangladeshi, because you have to resist the central part of the subcontinent that is India. So yes, there is another dialectic there between the country that is asserting itself and the countries fearing this assertion and becoming more assertive themselves.
And so would that not be more concerning for perhaps countries where you come from, Western countries, to perhaps pay closer attention to dynamics like these, which I must also admit are also gaining a lot of traction within your own native continent as well. This politics of far right expression, Would that not be concerning for international polity as well?
Well, we are concerned as scholars. I don't know whether the rulers of our countries are concerned, but definitely the rise of nationalism has never been very conducive for peace, has never been a conduit for peace. And, there is this very famous phrase that says democracies don't fight each other. There is no war between democracies. And the diminishing number of democracies in the world using nationalism as their main idiom is definitely taking us in a very dangerous direction.
And so I'll come to my last two questions now. And again, this second last question has to do with foreign policy as well. Speaking of how, India under Modi seems to be extremely confident in terms of its foreign policy and the way it sort of wants to conduct itself, both within the immediate region, but now also, far from the more familiar region of South Asia as well. The recent allegations that have actually been cast by Canada, and now this dossier that was released by US Department of Justice as well. Do you think it's also a symptom of that very assertive foreign policy that actually stems from home as well?
It can be. Well, we don't know yet what has really happened. But what we do know is that the kind of nationalistic assertion of India is now reaching these countries via the diaspora. The diaspora has become a very important conduit for influencing Western countries, influencing Western societies. And UK, Canada, the US are good, Australia are good examples of the way you can penetrate the diaspora with your ideology, with your organizations. And RSS and the Sangh Parivar at large are working on it for years.
And any few examples that come recently to your mind where you've seen more disturbing signs of such expression?
Well, two good examples are the Leicester riots between Hindus and Muslims. Leicester, in the center of Great Britain, has seen something that is a replica of what we see in India recurrently.
And what was it over exactly?
It was over a cricket match, unsurprisingly, and it was something that has been engineered by vigilante groups, which are part of these organizations. Another example is the bulldozers in New Jersey for a procession organized by Hindu nationalists, the same bulldozers which are destroying Muslim houses in Uttar Pradesh, as if so many miles away from the mother country, you could be proud of what was going on in your home country.
And now my last question, and this is about India and Pakistan, how that expression is sort of, spilling into sort of, directing perhaps a trajectory of a future crisis. And it's more about, seeking an inspiration from a conflict that has broken out in not so distant region of Middle East itself, where, after the attacks of Hamas in southern Israel on October 7th, we've seen Israel and Hamas get engaged in a conflict that has lasted for over many weeks and still has no end in sight despite, the short pauses in conflicts that we've seen. What we've really seen is that, in 2019, both India and Pakistan came to the brink of, a war breaking out, after the incidents of Pulwama and, of course, India's airstrike over Balakot. How dangerous do you think could an escalation in a nuclear-armed neighborhood be when a constituency in India, after what they've actually seen Israel do over Gaza, which actually believes that, military action is somehow possible without factoring in the serious risk of dangerous escalation involving two nuclear-armed neighbors, that is India and Pakistan?
Yeah, I don't think we can really compare the two scenarios. They are really different. First of all, because there is such an asymmetry on the Palestinian side. Pakistan and India, by contrast, are both nuclear powers. There is a symmetry there. The nuclear arms are the great equalizer.
But that's the very same fact when you don't have that realization of power parity, in the sense that you have nuclear deterrence possessed by both countries.
I think there is a realization. I don't think this kind of escalation can take place. Well, you should never say never, but the situation is very different. And if there is an escalation, it will be, and it was in 2019, somewhat calibrated. To go extreme is self-defeating on both sides. So I'm confident that...
So what you're basically suggesting is that one should actually shy away from drawing parallels of what is happening between Israel and Gaza versus what could take place between India and Pakistan.
Yes.
It could be extremely dangerous.
Yes. There are similarities. There is certainly a clear attempt by India at emulating the policies of Israel, to transform Muslims into second-class citizens, to somewhat colonize Kashmir by replacing the Kashmiri bureaucrats by non-Kashmiri bureaucrats, taking their land and so on and so forth. But that is a limited comparison, and the present situation is so different in the Middle East. Incidentally, we don't know what will be the final quote-unquote winner and loser. And according to the final result, some lessons will be drawn on both sides. But it's not for sure that Israel will be seen as succeeding by resorting to such action across the globe, including in New Delhi.
All right. So now my last question, and this is primarily about the plight of Muslims in India. And let me ask you, you've thrown a lot of statistics, in your conversations that you've had so far over here in Pakistan. But let me ask you, how do you really see, or how have you exactly seen the representation of Muslims in areas such as media and civil society? We've seen their numbers really go down when it comes to, their representation in the parliament itself. But how do you see their participation being affected in these two areas, where they can perhaps, sort of bring to a halt, or perhaps, reverse the course in terms of how Muslims are underrepresented in certain places in India? What future do you see of the civil society and the media? And perhaps what's the future of Muslims at large in the next 1 decade?
Yeah, well, again, not so easy to predict, but there is clearly a decline of the Urdu press. On the media scene, this is the most dramatic development so far as Muslims are concerned. Mm-hmm. And this is because Urdu as a language is not something Muslims can read as much as they used to. Mm-hmm. Civil society, it's very paradoxical. The more the state is alienating the Muslims, the more they have to find resources among their own organizations. Ghettoization, for instance, is on the rise. Muslims regroup in ghettos, like Juapura, near Ahmedabad, 500,000 people who have any access or hardly any access to public education, public hospitals. What have they done? They have done it themselves. They have built the roads, they have built the schools, they have built the hospitals. So you have a very paradoxical situation where a civil society has to be rebuilt within the Muslim community because the state is failing them. Now, of course, this is not a good situation because they are insulated and they are not as well equipped as they would be if the state was doing the job. But this is a paradoxical development which, you see, makes things more complicated than we could imagine at first sight.
Professor Christophe Jaffrelot, thank you so much for your time, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us for this conversation with Professor Christophe Jaffrelot. Our team works very hard to make this work possible, and it would mean the world to us if you could like and share our content And if you'd like to stay informed about our podcasts and other work, please hit the bell icon.